Well, I'm definitely feeling more alive now than I was before. Okay, so we're gonna be looking at a pretty famous story of Jesus in John. So it's gonna be John chapter 5. It's the healing at the pool on the Sabbath. So it's page 1204 if you have the sweet Bibles here. So we're gonna be looking at this passage through a little bit different of a lens. Kind of looking at the story where it shifts from a story of healing to a story of conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. So we're going to be reading from 5:9 to 16, but kind of a background. They've come into Jerusalem now. They come into the pool area. There are invalids, so they're blind, lame, and paralyzed. And there is one man who's been ill for 38 years. And so Jesus comes up to him, he approaches him, he says, "Do you want to be made well?" The man gives a kind of interesting response of, "Well, I kind of want to, but I can't get in the water." And so that leads us up to where we are in verse 8. Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take up your mat, and walk." And at once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath, so keep that in mind. It's a Sabbath. That's kind of important. We come back to that. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. So first off, this passage is kind of in this weird spot of where does it end? Where are the kind of the limits on it? Because Jesus goes on to then talk to the Jews. And so we're going to cut it here just for the sake of kind of time constraints. But this is an incredibly rich text. There are countless sermons that could be preached on this. You could have a sermon on the systemic and communal issues that leave a man waiting by the pool for 38 years. I mean, that's a pretty clear one. You could have a sermon on the urgency and the beauty of what Jesus has to offer, so kind of focusing on the healing aspect. The end of the passage, the part that I cut off right before, so verses 17 and 18, are about the identity of Jesus, and that's what he goes into, equating himself to God, and that's a pretty solid Christology. You could have maybe a more academic sermon or talk on the textual variants, how if you notice in the Bibles that verse 4 is not there, and all the implications and discussions that come with that. But tonight we'll be looking at something a little bit different. So as I said, we're going to be looking at the kind of transition from a story of healing to a story of conflict. And so to set up the lens that we're going to be looking at this through, I'm going to share a sort of aha moment that I had at the end of last year. So I took a class on the ethics of Martin Luther King with Hak Jun Lee. It's awesome, great professor. And so naturally what comes along with the class on Martin Luther King is, reading Martin Luther King. Loved it. It was beautiful. It resonated with me very much so. And so the next step is to read who inspired Martin Luther King. And so Gandhi, and even more so, Jesus. So I read the Passion narrative through a slightly different light. I had previously read the Passion narrative as this is salvific significance to save humanity. That's all it is. And that kind of overshadows the sort of external factors that are taking place actually in real life, like in those moments that lead to Jesus' death. I mean, we see that here, that the Jewish leaders begin persecuting Jesus. And so, kind of reflecting on that, Jesus questioned authority. He questioned the status quo. He threw a wrench in the social system that was set up in antiquity. He overturned tables, literally, figuratively. He ate with the unclean. He said things that are mind-blowing. Blessed are the meek and the poor. The last shall be first. I mean, all these things are it's like, whoa, that's crazy. Jesus is saying this to people, and they're not ready for this. but it comes from his love. So Martin Luther King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he's responding to pretty much the white moderates of the church who are saying, you're being way too extreme. And so he asked them this, was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. And this is what Jesus did, even in this passage, and the result of it was he was killed. So it goes to say that Jesus' love transcended boundaries, and it questioned the status quo, and he was killed. I mean, the ending result is he was killed. I mean, then we can look at the resurrection, and that's where we come into this whole conversation, but he was killed for it. And so some other modern examples, Abraham Lincoln is most remembered for the Emancipation Proclamation. He wanted to free the slaves, and he did. So he bestowed love upon his neighbor, and he was assassinated. Steve Biko was an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa. He stood against tyranny, colonialism, and racism, and he was murdered. Yitzhak Rabin was an individual who signed the Oslo Accords. So if you're not familiar with what that is, it was a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine, and he was assassinated. Salman Taseer was a politician in Pakistan, and so Pakistan has the blasphemy laws, and so if you say something that's blasphemous, then you'll be put to death. And so he questioned that. He stood up for a woman who was wrongfully convicted and executed, and he was murdered in 2011. So Gandhi and Martin Luther King, I mean, their names and reputations kind of stand on their own, but they are extremists for love, and they were killed. And so all of these people question the status quo, they question the system through love. They both love their neighbor and their enemies. So I mean, kind of referring back to the Sermon on the Mount, it's not just love your neighbor, it's loving your enemies also. And so all this goes to show that if you're actively loving like Jesus did, it's dangerous. So we see loving our neighbors in the Old Testament, loving your neighbors as yourself is in the Old Testament, and that sets an ethical minimum. But Jesus calls us into a space of dangerous love, and that's an ethical maximum. So even in the U.S., we have don't murder, and that's obvious. That's clearly a minimum. Nowhere in any legal document does it say you need to love people that persecute you or who are your enemies, but we're still called to that. So going back to John 5, we're going to be kind of reading this text through the lens of love. It's easy to get lost in the miraculous healing that Jesus does and to ignore the consequences, the conflict that it causes, and the underlying meaning, because the healing is a manifestation of Jesus' abundant love for this man. And so this is kind of reminiscent of last week that every human being has value. And so keep in mind that John offers a different gospel account than the Synoptic Gospels. Nowhere in here does Jesus say, oh, you had faith, I healed you. Jesus sought this man out, he went up to him, and he healed him. And that's amazing. But the other piece that comes with that we can kind of easily miss is that this man was restored back into society. That's what love can do. It can restore you, not just between you and God, but you kind of like on the horizontal level with society. So clearly the meaning of love is important in this text. And some may say that the work of Jesus, the healing, that was the meaning in itself, and I would argue against that and say that the underlying meaning was definitely love. I bought my wife a wedding ring a couple years ago, and people may be like, why'd you buy her a wedding ring? And it's not because it's tradition or it's a cultural value, I have to do this. And it's not because the ring is the meaning in itself, but it's the underlying meaning of love. And in the same way, Jesus healed this man. So the only difference here is that Jesus' love, the difference between my wife and Jesus, well, anyways. She's really great, though. The difference here is that Jesus' love questioned the social expectations and the status quo. It says, therefore, the Jews started persecuting him. So it's almost a cause and effect sort of process here. The Jewish leaders were upset that the man had been healed and picked up his mat and was carrying it around. And this isn't part of the 10 Commandments or the Great Two Commandments, but it's part of the 613 mitzvot. And so that was the status quo. That was the norm. But Jesus' love broke the social expectations because it has no boundaries. So let's look at a modern example, say a moral analogy. We have the United States housing bubble that burst in 2007. So if a family at church comes in and they talk to you about not being able to afford the mortgage on their house, there are a few different responses that you can have. You could affirm the Christian status quo and say, oh, you know what? We'll pray for you. In the same way, Jesus could have come back the next day, not the Sabbath, and healed the man. But he didn't do that. Or we could rally around the family that can't afford their mortgage, and we could pay for their mortgage. Doing that stands in opposition with our status quo. It stands in opposition to being a slave to money. It stands in opposition to our culture of greed. And it stands in opposition to the American dream of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It stands against all of these things with compassion and love, like Jesus. So I'm a Christian, we are Christians, and that means that we profess belief in Jesus as Christ and live accordingly to the teachings of Jesus. But how are we doing that in real life? How are you questioning the status quo? Is anything at risk when you love people? Because if nothing's at risk, then you're not loving people like Jesus. We are not loving people like Jesus. Even when we talk about a sort of romantic love, is it better to have loved and lost or not love at all? I mean, the risk is implicit in that. Because loving without reservation is a place of vulnerability and danger. So we see Jesus stand up for the rejected, the oppressed, and the marginalized, for the man who had been sitting by the pool for 38 years, and Jesus bestowed love to him, regardless of what the Jewish leaders thought, what the people in charge and thought, what the government social expectations were. And that happened. And we're called to love in the same way. Because we talk about how revolutionary Jesus was, and I don't know about you, but when I take a look around at the church, I see a place of safety, comfort, and complacency. And honestly, I know that I'm guilty of this too, but we're called to love. So if you want to be a Christian, you follow Jesus. If you want to follow Jesus, you follow to the point that leaders are put off by your extreme love. Love God, love your neighbors, and love your enemies. So how often do you hear pastors or people praying for Al-Qaeda? How often do you hear people praying for the political party that you don't see eye to eye with, for the Somalian pirates? We're called into that space and that depth of love. And so if you find yourself in a place that you're unsure of who or where to love, take a look around and notice the injustices that are taking place. They released a study that shows that even still now, women make 77 cents to the dollar of every man. Latina women make 58 cents to the dollar of every white man. If a boy doesn't play sports, you hear them, learn to be a man. We spend 20% of the federal budget on defense and 2% on education. Human trafficking generates $9.5 billion in the U.S. alone. 1/3 of women are sexually assaulted in their lifetime. If you have a mother, a wife, and a daughter, statistically speaking, one of them is going to be hurt. And so keep in mind that I'm not saying that you're called to be a martyr or that you should go out looking for danger for the sake of danger. That's obviously not the case. But danger is a result of authentically loving in the way that Jesus did. I don't think Jesus, if he were alive today, would just throw money to a problem, but he would be in relationship with people. Even with this quick miracle, Jesus checked in with the man afterwards. That's powerful. So giving money to the poor is good, but questioning the system that creates and enslaves the poor is better. It is this love that we are called into. The Jewish leaders were in charge, yet Jesus stood